Well, it's officially the Dynasty offseason. We're about 9 months out from regular season football, which means it's a great time to get back to some basic Dynasty strategy. Today, I'm going to be talking about my big picture offseason philosophy, which includes the dangers of roster screenshots and the importance of patience and flexibility. My name is Paul. This is Pure Potential. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, leave a comment. Let's get into it. All right, so today's strategies are going to be most applicable to those dynasty teams that find themselves kind of in the middle. You know, if you've built yourself a super team, you can just sit back for a few months, put your feet up. You don't have to do anything. And if your team is like a total disaster, you took over an orphan or you made some really bad decisions, you pretty much just have to burn everything to the ground, start over for next year, and hopefully have the 101 in your back pocket at that point. But there are a lot of teams that are either coming out of a planned rebuild or maybe just a bad luck season that are kind of in between. These are more fragile teams. These are teams that are pretty average in terms of buying power or dynasty value. They might be heavily concentrated around a few star players. Maybe they're just kind of thin from top to bottom. Maybe they have some glaring holes in the starting lineup, right? These are teams that could kind of go either way, where you have to actually think about, where is this team going in 2025? Those are the ones that really need to be locked in for the offseason and need to make good choices. And trust me, I've been there with a lot of teams. You know, I've got over 20 dynasty teams. They are not all perfect. They're not all super teams, far, far from it. So I know very well that the decisions that you make over the next 6, 7, 8 months can really determine what type of season that you are in for. And one thing you really want to be doing is protecting yourself from downside as much as possible, because these fragile dynasty teams, they can be kind of a house of cards. You know, it just takes the little slight breeze of negative variance to bring everything tumbling down. And so the best way to protect yourself from downside is to try to keep your buying power as high as possible. And when I say buying power, I'm talking about trade equity, right? The full value of your assets, what you can get for them in a trade. Because ultimately, whenever you have a lost season or a rebuilding season, that comes from a lack of buying power, not necessarily a lack of scoring potential. If you don't have enough high scoring players to compete, but you have 15 future firsts, that's a really easy problem to solve. You can just go and buy yourself a contender. Rebuilding should really only happen when your team's buying power has become too depleted to sustain a competitive lineup. And sometimes that does mean throwing in the towel early on a team that technically has a chance, because, you know, waiting another year to tear it all down could put you in a really bad spot. But the point is, you don't want to find yourself in a situation where you're near the bottom of your league in terms of buying power. That's really the worst spot you can be in. I would much rather have the worst current starting lineup in my league than have the least buying power, because it's typically a lot easier to turn buying power into production than it is to go the other way around. So one way you can avoid downside is by shifting value from riskier players into rookie picks or more insulated assets. For example, take a guy like Brian Robinson. This is a player that I'm totally avoiding this offseason. He's a low ceiling player, and I think he's at significant risk of being replaced in the offseason. He didn't have a really incredible season. He kind of tailed off towards the end of the year. You know, the Commanders are still live here in the divisional round, but I don't think he's going to figure much into their game plan against the Lions this week. So the point is, I think he's a very replaceable running back, both from a fantasy perspective and from a real life perspective. And in most leagues right now, just looking at where he sits on Fantasy Calc, on Keep Trade Cut, I think you can get like a mid 2025 second for him pretty easily, maybe a random 2026 second. And I'm happy to take that, because even if Robinson survives free agency, survives the draft, I'm probably still going to want the pick, honestly. Like, he scored 11.4 points per game this year. But either way, I can just trade for a running back of that caliber later when the risk is significantly lower. I'm always going to be able to find some running back to score 12 points per game for the price of a mid-second. I don't have to ride the roller coaster all offseason and think, okay, you know, here's one of my locked-in starters for week 1. I've got Brian Robinson, and then the draft comes and they take somebody in round 2, and all of a sudden I'm screwed, right? There's another spot I have to fill. You don't want to put yourself in that position because, again, you're already working with minimal buying power. You're already kind of trying to put this whole thing together on a shoestring budget so that you don't dig yourself into some deep hole that you have to rebuild out of. And so you just want to avoid that type of risk whenever you can. And unless your league is really, really inactive, where it's hard to get trades done, or maybe your league mates drastically undervalue rookie picks, there's really not a limit to how far I would take this. I have had plenty of teams that I've rebuilt where going into May or June, I have like 4 actual players on my team and everything else is just picks. And then I'm able to draft some good rookies, flip some picks for other good players, fill in the gaps with whatever cheap veterans people don't want. And all of a sudden, I have a competitive team when the season rolls around. It is not always pretty, but it absolutely works. And that brings me to my next point, which is that pretty roster screenshots in February have very little correlation to championships in December. I can't tell you how many times I have gone into an offseason or even into a regular season with a team where I think this team is set. I am going to cruise into the playoffs. I'm going to get myself a bye. I'm going to go win. And those teams can totally underperform and they can crash and burn. And then I have these other teams that are like, yeah, I'm probably in the playoff mix. We'll see how it goes. And all of a sudden, I win 10 in a row and that team cruises to the championship. So it doesn't have to look that pretty. A lot of the guys we think are going to score points don't. A lot of the guys we don't expect to score points come out of nowhere. There are no bonus points awarded for having an aesthetically pleasing roster. And yet, despite all of this, I do see so many people in the offseason making ill-advised trades because they need a running back. And I just want to yell at them and say, no, you don't. You don't need a running back because NFL Week 1 doesn't kick off until September 5th. And you can go trade for a running back on September 4th and plug them into your lineup, and you're going to get the same number of points either way. And I'm not even saying to actively avoid trades that fill perceived needs on your team. I've got no issue with it as long as the value is good, but you really should be prioritizing buying power over anything. You should be trying to accrue value right now, keep yourself flexible, and be able to make the moves that you want to make throughout the offseason, because it is a long offseason and patience is almost always going to be the best approach. But people really struggle, I think, to separate the in-season mentality from the offseason mentality, when really they're totally different games. In-season management is like perfection. I don't know if you've ever played that game. You take the little yellow pieces and you have to fit them into the correct slots before the time runs out or it explodes or whatever. That game will take years off your life. It's so stressful. The off-season is not like that. The off-season is like chess. Okay, you can sit back, you can survey the board, you can make a plan before you make a move. And you really should take your time. I think being hasty, being impatient has gotten dynasty managers burned far more often than taking the cautious approach, taking their time. You gain very little by declaring, I'm a contender, I'm a rebuilder in January or in March or even in May. I mean, even then, you still have a whole summer ahead of you where a lot of unpredictable things can happen between then and week 1. And by staying as flexible as possible, you can avoid disaster. Now, my personal favorite way to toe the line between contender and rebuilder when I know I've got a fragile team, and this is really what I've been building towards in this video. I think this is an underrated roster construction because it seems counterintuitive, but I think the best thing you can do is to strike a balance between rookies and picks and cheap veterans. So the picks give you security, especially your future first. If you're coming out of the season with a slightly more fragile team, you don't really know which direction things are going to go, the last thing you want to do is trade away that 2026 first, because that is your insurance policy. That's your emergency parachute. Okay, if you have some bad variance in the summer, the season starts poorly, you at least know you've got an easy pivot to rebuilding. You can lock up the 101. You know you're definitely going to have the buying power that you need next season. So you want to have picks, and you don't need to just have your own picks. You can go out and get more picks, future seconds, future thirds, fourths, whatever. Just have a little stash of picks that's going to keep your buying power somewhat secure. And then you add in those rookies. That's another layer of security because those rookies are going to be more insulated value than your typical young players, right? Your year 3, year 4 players. And those rookies are going to have the chance to grow in value exponentially and potentially even contribute to your lineup, right? Think of the rookies you could start this year at different times: Neighbors, Ladd, Daniels, Drake May, Bo Nix, Brian Thomas, Xavier Worthy, Bucky Irving, Tyrone Tracy. There were guys in this class that you were happy to start. And that's usually the case. There are going to be rookies that come on throughout the season that you can also play. And so they serve a dual purpose of keeping value insulated, but also providing production. And then you take those dusty veterans and you can ensure that you have at least some chance to make the playoffs. You just cobble together a cheap lineup. You go out and you get Mike Evans and James Conner, right? Guys that are not going to be super expensive, but they're pretty locked into their current situations. You know that they're going to produce barring injury. You know, if they get hurt, you pretty much just have to eat it, but otherwise they're going to score a good number of points, and you can always flip them to other contenders if you find that the rest of your team's just not ready. But I'd prioritize those kind of secure, cheaper veterans over guys with uncertain outlooks. Guys like Devontae Adams, for example, kind of unclear, right? Where is he going to play? Who's going to be his quarterback next year? You can be left holding the bag with him. Whereas Mike Evans, it's pretty much either he gets hurt or he shows up day one and he's just washed. But otherwise, there's just not a lot of risk there, and you're locking yourself into like 16, 17 points per game otherwise. And so you can take on a little risk with those veterans, knowing that you have the rookies, knowing that you have the picks, and again, that you have this quick pivot into rebuild mode if things don't go well. But the whole key there is maintaining the flexibility to let your team go the way it needs to go and not fight against the tide too much. Now, the natural byproduct of this strategy is that you do have to kind of forego the young breakout candidates, because those guys can be expensive, right? So a guy like JSN is not somebody you'd have on this type of roster construction, because going into the year, still fairly expensive, level of risk is somewhat high, and it's not clear whether he's going to be a high-end producer or not, right? It ended up working out. You would have been happy to have him, but it's the trade-off that you make with this roster construction. You're prioritizing picks and rookies, cheap veterans. All your buying power is going into those two groups. There's just not a lot of room left to take these tactical, risky bets on those breakout candidates. Maybe on other teams, you can afford to do that, but this is my specific plan for those fairly low-value teams. You're not ready to throw away a season and commit to a rebuild, but you want to give yourself the option if you need it. Anyway, that's going to do it for today, guys. That's a very basic overview of my offseason philosophy, some fun roster construction conversation there. I will be back soon with some actual player takes, I promise. As always, thank you so much for watching the video. Thank you for supporting the channel. If you enjoy my Dynasty content, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Really goes a long way. We're closing in on that 5,000 subscriber mark, and I'd love to hit it in January as well. And if you want more Dynasty content from me, you can hit the join button as well under the video or on my channel page. It'll let you become a YouTube member, which, depending on the tier that you choose, will give you access to my top 200 Dynasty rankings, private channels in the Pure Potential Discord, as well as weekly live streams that are only available to YouTube members. Either way, I'll be back soon with another Dynasty video, and I hope I'll see you then.